Welcome to Go FUD Yourself, episode 47.
47.
47. You know, Mikhail, I was going to say that obviously JD's not here today, but you guys have the same haircut, so maybe people wouldn't notice right off. Maybe you can just slide in.
I think you guys, I see the strategy here. Just replace one bald guy with another.
It's okay. Last week they replaced one woman with another, so we're even more interchangeable.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do the same stunts that JD does, but I'll do my best.
Yeah, you're not going to show off your shirt today? You're not going to back up and talk about your weird Lambo shirt?
I have my, oh man, where is it? I have my I Love Certic hoodie.
Oh, yes.
Did not wear it. Did not wear it today. So
awesome. Well, for viewers, you might remember Mikhail. We've done a couple of episodes together. I think you came on a token securities episode last quarter. Yep. And you've had JD on your Network Spotlight show, which I believe is weekly. And Mikhail, what else do you want to tell us about yourself? Who are you? Where do you live? Why are you here?
Every day I'm trying to figure that out myself. My name is Mikhail.
I do a lot of crypto things. Anonymous, no?
Yeah, that's the crypto way, right? Mr. Anonymous. So I spearhead a lot of the business development and strategic partnership initiatives at Certic, which, by the way, none of the opinions here are going to be representative of Certic. I'm going to represent myself, but I have to say that. I'm also the founder of Network Spotlight, which is a community of builders, ecosystem heads, VCs that are pioneering Web3, which, by the way, thank you for being part of that networking group. So yeah, I'm extremely passionate about Web3. I started my journey in marketing, then went into security and, picking up on the latest trends.
Okay, well, today's latest trends, we are going to talk about the crypto arms race. And we will talk about some exploits, which I'm not trying to exploit your knowledge on exploits, but here we are. And then we'll talk about some final things about DeFi meeting the world. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Do you like our banger of a song? Do you dig it?
I love that intro. I keep thinking that's me on the cover too.
Well, yeah, we made it especially for you today.
I don't have the tattoos like Jaden.
So we're gonna start with the crypto arms race today. I have a noisy dog today. I don't know why today has to be the dog day.
It's Friday. It's just happy.
We're going to start with the crypto arms race. I don't know, Mikhail, I know that you watch sometimes. The crypto arms race was originally supposed to actually be people gearing up to compete in crypto, but it's kind of turned into international news, just general international news. Do you find that the regular international news actually interacts with crypto news very often?
Yes, very much so. Because when you look at what's happening in the world, when it comes to inflation, when it comes to war, all of those events have a direct impact on the crypto industry. So I think during the bull market, a lot of times we're spending so much of our attention looking at the technology, and all those things are extremely important, of course. But more and more, we're looking at other events that are impacting the industry and what's happening internationally from a war standpoint, or just countries gaining up on US. All those things have an impact on what's happening. So
have you heard about the de-dollarization versus the balkanization discussion of trying to get rid of the USD?
I haven't heard about that one. I hear about
so there's these two schools of thought. There's one that's balkanization, whereas the USD loses clout. Every country will have their own coin, and every country will have their own CBDC or their own stable coin, and we'll have all of these little mini coins that are kind of like trying to back each other and what have you. Whereas de-dollarization says that countries and groups like BRICS and ASEAN will get together and they will basically replace USD for being the strongest currency. And something that's interesting in that realm is we're seeing from Bitcoin.com that commodity strategists are warning that there's a recession and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So this is pretty much about commodities, credit, increased interest rates, real estate, all sorts of contagion fears about banking and so on and so forth. But we're seeing that in America, there's going to be a recession first. And meanwhile, other countries like China last week reported that they're through their recession. So I don't know how to critical think this. Like, is it propaganda? Are we having our own propaganda? What's actually going on here?
I think there's some truth to this. I think it's going to take a very long time for the dollar to collapse. But when you look at the history, all currencies have their highs and then they eventually collapse, right? Portugal, I want to say 18th century was they had the highest currency, the most valuable, the dependent currency. So on average, a currency can only be number one for about 100 years on average. And we're going on about 110 years. So, I mean, are we due for, a collapse? Maybe, but it's not one of those things that will happen overnight. I think there's a lot of different events that need to transpire in order for that to happen. But we're starting to see some of that, right? With BRICS, with everything that's happening in the U.S. from a regulatory standpoint around crypto regulation. We're stifling innovation. Businesses are looking to move to other countries, and I'm sure we'll talk about Coinbase as well. So there's a lot of that happening. It's going to take some time, but we're starting to see a little preview, and so hopefully we'll get our act together and make some changes.
I like to ask the question, do you think that the next leading currency could be a crypto that has no nation back? Part of why I say this is that Bitcoin today is going back down, and people are talking about how it's one of the first times that fiat and crypto are actually hand in hand in terms of value. And some people think that this is because we're waiting for the May 3rd Federal Open Market Committee meeting where they might raise or maintain interest rates, but that's super American. So if we're thinking that Bitcoin is really an international currency, that wouldn't really be the reflection. If we're seeing BRICS, if we're seeing the USD come to its expiration date over 100 years, like, is Bitcoin the next world currency?
I think we're a long ways away from that happening, but I do believe that a lot of people are preparing for the potential unknown, right? And traditionally, the strength of the dollar is an inverse relation to Bitcoin. Anytime it dips, Bitcoin typically goes up. But we'll see if that trend will continue in the long term. I do think that Bitcoin it certainly has its place, right? When you compare it to silver, when you compare it to gold, it's a commodity, it's a store of value, and it's a lot more easier to attain than to keep, say, gold on hand, right? So that there's a lot of people that are potentially getting off the gold and coming over to Bitcoin as they're learning more about the technology and all the capabilities. But there's also a darker side to it, right? You're looking at countries like Russia that are trying to go about doing cross-border payments using cryptocurrency, right? And so when the United States, when they look at that, how will they respond to that from a regulatory standpoint? Is that going to be a good thing? Are we saying, yay, there's a great use case for this, or could it potentially lead to more regulation and more issues for us? So it's a wait and see game, but I think that anybody that has achieved life-changing wealth, not speaking, this is not financial advice, but, investing in assets, that's the way to go. That's the only way you can beat out inflation. And Bitcoin is essentially an inflation hedge. And that's what it's designed to do.
That's a really great summary. It's also interesting to think about this in comparison to what banks are trying to do to maintain their importance, right? As you say, people might move away from traditional investments and into something that they can hedge their bets on differently in a digital way. And so yesterday we had all of this hype about the EU because they announced MiCA, where they actually have some really clear regulation for crypto. It was in the making for 3 years. It's not dumb regulation. It's quite meaningful. But then just right after that, one of the banks in France released their own stable coin, and it's supposed to be euro backed, and people don't love it. They do not love it. So people really are kind of moving away. The sentiment surrounding banks has gotten more and more negative, and I think crypto gives us that platform to be negative about it and still feel safe financially, right?
Yeah, I mean, from what I hear, a lot of people feel like it's essentially a CBDC, right? Because so the way I understand it is they coded it so that you have to whitelist all the users, process all user transfers, and even process your ERC-20 approvals before they process your transfer form from. So it sounds like essentially this is just like a extremely regulated, centralized way of doing cryptocurrency, right? So essentially it's a
Okay, in
CBDC.
their defense, it is supposed to be an institutional currency, like from bank to bank, essentially.
Right, but I mean, it's a ERC-20 at the end of the day, and so yeah, so from that perspective, I think that backlash is warranted, but
This
I
one's
don't know if we
interesting.
need to hit the
So
drawing board on that.
Societe Generale is the bank, and the other thing that I think is interesting about this, being a marketing person, is that they haven't had very good PR. So they announced that they were the first bank to do anything like this, when actually JP Morgan has basically the same thing, but not on a public blockchain. But Australia's national bank does have more or less this exact same thing, that's institution to institution on a public blockchain. So they're kind of facing like a lot of backlash. It's not just the coding, it's also almost like they didn't do quite enough research to launch it.
Well, I didn't hear as much backlash about I mean, it was almost portrayed as, hey, this is great because we're seeing the transition into the digital world from banks. This is the first time that I'm seeing or reading about more from a negative connotation in terms of they just did not do it correctly. When JP Morgan did it, it was like, hooray, first cross-border transaction. I believe they were utilizing Polygon and Aave. So everyone was really excited about that, but not so much this.
One of the other things that's interesting here is the criticism of needing to be whitelisted. Of course, I can defend that and say, well, it's supposed to be institutional, it's not peer-to-peer. But most of the success that we've actually seen for CBDCs or any sort of actual currency-backed stablecoin has been for peer-to-peer transactions. So if we want it to be successful and we want to have these retail uses, they haven't really set themselves up to scale the project at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much of an opinion aside from
It's
the
fine.
fact
I'm just putting you on the spot here. So
you are, but it's okay. No, I do think that I understand that there are centralized components to this. I mean, that there has to be, right? Because as you said, this is an institution at the end of the day. But you're obviously not getting the support from the individuals. Now, people that are truly in crypto, that you may never get their support, right? But I think we have to find this common ground, this fine line there, and it's going to take some time to get there.
it's interesting watching all of these countries kind of try to find a stablecoin solution. I've talked in previous episodes quite a bit about Russia and BRICS and how they want to have a CBDC so that they can bypass sanctions imposed by the USD, but they also have quite a few internal restrictions on how people can use crypto within Russia. And they just announced today that they're going to work on an experimental legal regime for crypto assets. And that will be everything from peer-to-peer to governmental use as well. And so this is like a really big step when we think about the world power and the recession coming up in America and potential interest rate hikes and all of these different components. And Russia's like, you know what? No, we will explore. We're going to do it.
So yeah, and up to this point, they have not allowed for it to be used internally, like within the country. So you're saying that now they're open to trying that?
Yeah, they're looking at cross-border trade transactions, and they're also looking at the government having a mining arm, like a crypto mining arm, which feels a little bit too late, but I'm not too privy to comment on that. I'm not a miner.
Yeah, I mean, Russia's pretty big on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general. So and obviously there's an incentive there. As we talked about earlier, there are sanctions against Russia, and so they're looking for ways to get around that. How that plays out, we'll have to see. In a way, part of me wants it to work, right? Because it's like a perfect use case for why cryptocurrency exists, and the other part of it is we don't want it to be on a bad spotlight, right?
Absolutely. It's a great PC way to put that. So, okay, what I think is really interesting about this is we talk about the crypto arms race and we talk about world powers, right? So we've spoken about the EU, we spoke about, not today, but we often speak about different areas in Asia and China and Russia and the States, of course. But what we have coming up now is that Coinbase is threatening to leave America, and they're doing a lot of global expansion. And although it's a little bit dystopian to think about, we kind of have this place where world powers might no longer be the countries themselves, but the coins or the institutions managing those coins. So people are really upset about Coinbase securing this Bermuda license because it looks as though they're going to do a full expansion into the coastal region and possibly shut down their American arm.
Yeah, I mean, keyword there is possibly. But it almost feels like one foot out the door, right? And that's not something that we want to see here. And I don't think Congress wants to see that either. And that's a big reason why, Gary Gensler was on the hot seat and had to answer a lot of tough questions. I did not want to be that guy watching those videos and how he was just like shaking. It's tough, right? Because there's certainly a lot of clarity that needs to be brought to the regulatory space. And, Coinbase has been in the thick of it all, right? With them getting the Wells notice and basically saying, hey, look, we try to work with you and we are running out of ways to communicate with you. And it seems like from Capitol Hill, that's the same sentiment, right? When asking Gary about those, questions, like, have you tried to work with these institutions, with these companies? And, maybe it's just one side of it, but from what we're seeing, there hasn't been much of an effort. It has not been a two-way street there. And so Coinbase is looking at it like, hey, you're not really giving us many options. So, we need to start planning. At the end of the day, they're a business. They have to run a business. And if they leave, I wouldn't blame them at all, but certainly hoping that doesn't happen.
I mean, I hope it doesn't happen too, but America seems to be the only place that's policing first and regulating second. So enforcement through policing instead of enforcement through regulation. And that's a really difficult place to operate in. There's too many unknowns for any small business to operate. And Coinbase is huge. And if they're looking at it, it makes me wonder what happens to the rest of the crypto companies in the States.
I'll put you on the spot. I have a quick question for you to see if you have an answer. How would you say the United States regulations compare to, say, Canada?
Yeah, we've talked about it a little bit. If you want a really in-depth explanation, I think I have a whole episode where I rant about Canada because we had just brought in some new regulations, I'm going to say 2 months ago now. But more or less, Canada has already said that it's SEC, everything's a security. And that has been the belief for about 2.5 years already. They said they were going to do it before it came into play. So people had time to kind of sell off and figure out what they wanted to do with their portfolio. I feel like I'm breaking up, of course.
No, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. But the other thing that's interesting is just about 2 months ago, they introduced a new way for organizations to come into compliance. So rather than do the enforcement first, they looked at doing the regulation first. But they didn't offer organizations long enough to really come into compliance. They gave them just under 30 days including the announcement. So for any large company like Kraken has done really well with that because they already had a number of these things in place for America or for other global expansion. But quite a few of the smaller crypto companies in Canada have looked to move elsewhere. Or we saw 3 of our largest companies actually join forces. So they did an MA, and that is the only way that they were able to come into compliance fast enough to still be competitive in the market and not just get fined within Canada. So I think that we're not really leading the way in innovation, but I can be appreciative that we aren't leading the way in enforcement either. Canada. It's a time.
Oh, Canada.
One of the things actually that's interesting about this Coinbase business is in their expansion to the Bahamas, or sorry, to Bermuda, not to the Bahamas. In their expansion to Bermuda, they are saying that one of the reasons they're moving there is that there's a lot of clarity in regulation. And that's also why they're comfortable working within the UK and other smaller countries, is they've been more agile and they've put regulation in place faster with more clarity. Whereas the States is still kind of like fumbling in a way, right? Like they're arguing over who's even going to regulate it. And that makes it really difficult for a business to operate. And it makes it really difficult to have positive risk management, honestly.
You know, we have the SEC, we have the CFTC, we have the IRS. Like, who's the leading dog in this, right? Who's going to tell us exactly how it is? There's just doesn't seem to be as much communication going on between those three organizations. And so that is not really a recipe for clarity when it comes to regulation. So they need to figure that out. And I think that's what Congress is looking at, right? In removing Gary Gensler and potentially doing a little reorg there to help with better communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, everyone's putting regulation forward because they say that it'll make it safer for the retail user, right? And this is a great segue into exploits. There are a lot of exploits, but we can't just say that like FTX is the problem, right? And a lot of these regulatory finger pointers are looking at it exactly that way, when actually we see that we lose a huge amount of money from unknown exploits, like $10 million in the past 5 months from this wallet exploit. So more or less, they are going into wallets. They're taking primary currencies like ETH. They are changing them into Bitcoin, and then they're using not Tornado because Tornado's closed, but they're using other swirlers and stealing that money. Weirdly, they're not stealing NFTs. I guess those are too hard to to change into some sort of other asset. But how do we look at these sorts of things, which are so far from being regulated, when the SEC and the CFTC are just jostling for position? We continue to face these problems, right?
Yeah, I mean, these problems will continue to face these problems because, well, so with FTX, there's certain rules that are actually being brainstormed right now. Like, for instance, I think I just saw this morning, there's a Texas bill that's being passed where exchanges need to, it's a proof of reserves bill, essentially. So it's going to require digital assets to provide sufficient funds, right? So there's going to be a rule that will be put in place where if they don't, well, they run the risk of losing their license. So that one is pretty interesting. And if that one passes, it'll pass in September. So that's something to keep in mind from centralized exchanges standpoint. But from a decentralized world, then yes, you also have attacks that happen on smart contracts, and not just on smart contracts, right? It could be on the front end, it could be on the back end. And so being that I work in security and I talk to a lot of these projects, one of the things that I always try to emphasize is the importance of having everything secured, right? And that is, that's the challenge for a lot of projects. So a project may have really good intentions, but they may not necessarily have everything audited because they just may not have the resources to have everything secured. But that's where it starts, right? And also on the flip side of that, the community needs to be educated on the kinds of smart contracts that they're interacting with, right? And so if you go to shameless plug, but skynet.certic.com, you can see every single project that has been audited by Certic and the ones that have not been audited by Certic. So we've expanded, we revamped the scoring system to include everybody. And this is done in order to create more transparency, right? So initially it was for our clients that have been audited, but now we've expanded to include everybody. And this has created a sense of urgency for projects that even the ones that have not been audited by Certic to come to us and say, hey, what do we need to do to increase our score, right? And there's like different variables that we look at, right? So is the team KYC'd? What's the code security like? What's the market cap, right? What's happening on chain, right? So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but the things that can be controlled, we would assist them and help them increase that level of transparency and security. So I think this is an ongoing thing where we just need to continue to educate both the businesses that are conducting this type of business and also the users. They need to also be well educated and understanding. So I think it's going to take some time to help alleviate these exploits that will always happen. It's always a cat and mouse chase between innovation and security. But the more education that happens in the space, the better it will be. And there needs to be an incentive for these projects to actually want to stay secure.
It's interesting to talk about educating the user, because sometimes the user is educated and we just get too excited. And I think that, right, like we need to get rid of the hype and the FUD, which is why we're here today. But when we think of this Subway themed trading bot that's doing the sandwich attacks, I think this is a great example, because they are targeting 2 meme coins that have seen 400x growth in a few days. And so it's a great, easy place to attack, because you know that people are engaged and people are going to be making quick decisions, and people might not make an educated decision, right?
Yeah, the front running has been an issue for some time, and I know that talking to other engineers, which I'm not one, but talking to other engineers, one of the biggest knocks, if there is one, on Ethereum is proof of stake and some of the centralized components and how easy it is to conduct these types of attacks. So, I'm curious to see how moving forward, Ethereum is still in transition mode, right? We just had the Shanghai update. There's more to come. So as they continue to evolve, how will they address that particular concern? I'm not sure yet. I'm sure that solution exists. It just needs to be implemented. But this is one of the reasons why some of the engineers in the space are not the biggest fans of Ethereum.
It's fun to say that it just needs to be solutioned, because to me, that's totally DeFi meets real world. Is like, we've been kind of living in our own weird bubble for a long time. And now as centralized exchanges and institutions and regulation come in, it's almost jarring to get that real world exposure, right? The average person is not going to put up with wild gas increases, for example, right? Something else they might not put up with, and this is our last story, I promise. Something else they might not put up with is borrow, lending, staking without a credit score. This was something I actually thought was really interesting when I was first introduced to Banky a few years ago, is the concept that I could pay off my student loan by borrowing against Banky, especially in terms of a liquid staking solution. And then I would still have money to spend while I paid off like a real world loan. And that was only made feasible because there were no credit scores. Not that my credit score is that bad, but you can't do that in real life, right? I can't take out a bank loan to pay off another loan, or at least you shouldn't be able to. Maybe you can in America. I don't know. But we're seeing TransUnion, which is, a real life normal company, come forward and say, hey, we have a DeFi solution, right? And we're finally seeing this institutional grade, real world solutioning of problems we've had for years.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that they partner with Spring Labs and Quadrata, which is interesting. We're starting to see this combination of the real world, I guess our legacy system, transition into the digital world that we're in. And we originally got a little sniff of it with S&P. I believe they did a analysis of Compound, which was huge to provide a credit rating, and it was actually pretty good. And so we're also starting to see more and more emphasis on a credit score and alleviating the risk. And the hope is that moving forward, right, when we have these ups and downs in the market, it'll help minimize some of that volatility because there's just a little bit more safeguards in place. So this is good. I'm happy to see that.
So you're with Certic. I know that this is the hot news, but you talk about trends all day, every day. I mean, I've seen your own podcast. What else are you exposed to that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I do spend a lot of time talking to projects. I go to a lot of these conferences. Right now, the talk of the town is L2s and how they're scaling Ethereum. ZK technology is becoming more and more prevalent. we're starting to see it also in the regulatory space as well. There are certain players that are trying to find a way to preserve privacy while at the same time being regulatory compliant, right? Helping DAOs to minimize their interaction with OFAC sanctioned countries. So when you think about a DAO fully decentralized, right, and like for them to comply with regulation, like most people don't put the two together, but there's certain businesses out there that are trying to do that, trying to find that fine line. And so going back to the L2s, so like Arbitrum, there's a lot of activity happening there. Optimism, there's some other ones that are a little bit smaller. ZK Sync is another one. So we're starting to see a lot of activity there. Personally, I'm excited about what's happening within the Cosmos ecosystem. There's a lot of development activity there. So I was looking there's different charts out there that will show like who's working on the actual chain, and then the sub ecosystem, which would be like the applications on top, or the other chains that are building within that ecosystem. And Cosmos has a lot going on, and they're creating a lot of advanced DeFi solutions. So I'm really excited about that from a development standpoint. Again, not financial advice, but just looking at it from a development standpoint. I like to look to see where the development activity is happening. And also when I talk to a lot of the engineers, they really enjoy working with Cosmos SDK, which is a core component needed in order to build a lot of these chains within Cosmos. And they just like how easy it is to use it. So you've got two different opposite sides. On one hand, you've got scaling through layer 2s, and who knows, maybe we'll reach layer 3s. But on the other hand, you have this interoperability in all these different chains within Cosmos. And then there's certain people within my community that are saying, hey, don't forget about Solana. And they have very strong ties to Solana Foundation, and they believe that, look, they're still in beta. So despite the fact that they had 10 or so crashes, or they don't even like to say the C word, but setbacks.
I don't blame them.
Let's just put it, setbacks. That it's still that we're all just still learning, right? And they've been able to scale, and they just need to fix a few things, and everything will be back to normal. I mean, that remains to be seen, but nonetheless, they do have a pretty strong NFT community, second largest behind Ethereum. So the development's still happening there. People are not running away. And so when I look at that, I think that will dictate what will happen in the future. And so once we get back into hype mode and bull trends, we may see some of these things play out.
I always love your insight. I'm sure I'm getting rugged internet-wise at this moment because my notification came on. So sorry. Sorry if there's a delay, but I always love your insight. You are so refreshing and well-spoken, and I find that you think about things in this really holistic way. So if people, where should they find you?
Yeah, great question. So they can reach me on Twitter. My DMs are open. It's at Jurgen Giev. We can include a description for people. It's basically an extended version of my last name. I'm on Telegram. I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, feel free to reach out. Happy to answer.
Will you be at Consensus? Can they come high five you at Consensus?
Oh, absolutely. Would love to shake some hands. Yeah, I'll be there 26th, 27th, and 28th. I'm actually hosting my own event. I'll get a few people come in. So if anybody's interested in joining, yeah, absolutely. Would love to connect.
Amazing. Well, enjoy your weekend and go FUD yourself.
Yeah, go FUD yourself. Thanks so much, Ceara.